I want to focus on some themes that I hope will resonate with you. Themes of connectedness and interrelatedness are more and more important to me the older I get and the longer I've been in this field. At a global and contextual level, in the example of reading at a linguistic and neurobiological level, at an interpersonal and intrapersonal level. Really, when you think about it, connections and interrelatedness characterize our journey across time and space and this amazing invention of language that we see rather than hear, reading and literacy. Now, some of you may recognize this title. My good friend and colleague, Mark Seidenberg, published a book earlier this year, Language at the Speed of Sight, that does a very good job, a remarkable job of telling the story of reading science. But he really laments that the success of reading sciences has created a paradox, because now from science we know so much about reading, but how can it be that literacy levels are still so low for so many? He believes that part of the problem is a profound disconnection between the science of reading, which has galloped ahead, and educational practices. He thinks that to many in education, the scientific perspective is seen as very sterile and reductive and incapable of capturing the chemistry and the real beauty of a child learning successfully with good teaching. Now, all of us should feel profoundly proud to be part of IDA, the International Dyslexia Association, because since its start, almost 100 years ago, there's been an embrace of science and an interdisciplinary approach to assessment and treatment of reading problems and research in that area. But most importantly, IDA has always, throughout its history, had a profound openness to facing unanswered questions. Some of you may have seen that yesterday in some of the symposia we participated in. And there are many, many questions that remain in terms of our understanding of dyslexia. Will we ever be able to identify with precision the causes of dyslexia and other reading problems? How many causal pathways to dyslexia exist? Can prediction ever really lead to prevention? And most importantly for us as a group, what makes for effective intervention at different ages and stages of reading development, and for children who come to us with different profiles of comorbidity? But that's okay that there's a lot that we don't yet have answers for, because questions spur creativity, good science, and better practice. So in my time this morning, and I have a timer going right in front of me to make sure I don't get too relaxed, as well as my husband to shoot daggered looks at me if I go over time. I want to focus on these themes of connectivity and interrelatedness that are so important. And I'm going to really divide the presentation into 3 sections. In the first section, I would like to talk a little bit about what I perceive as some of our scientific progress on dyslexia, and ask, is any of this relevant to effective intervention? In the second part, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my own story and my own career, taken in collaboration with some of the people in the front row here, good friends and colleagues of 30 plus years, and talk a little bit about our intervention research and what we've learned from that. then I want to spend the last part of the presentation really thinking about outreach and sharing with you some of the initiatives we've undertaken with teachers, trying to share some of our collective knowledge and expertise, of which there is so much at IDA and among you, and thinking about issues of implementation. So the first part, science themes. Can research advances lead us in new directions to help those who struggle with reading? Well, there has been an explosion of new, wonderful, beautiful science on the neurobiology of reading disorders and reading development in the last decade or 15 years, and an understanding that genetics and experience are potentially causal. I believe quite strongly that we have a better understanding of dyslexia and reading problems and what to do about them by seeing the many levels of connection that exist across systems. The obvious connections between speech and language development and reading development. The connections between what we understand and know about instruction and intervention for reading disorder, and the connections that we are coming to understand that exist among gene, brain, and behavior. Now, at one obvious level, we've always been aware of some of the connections and interrelatedness because we've been aware for a long time that there are connections across developmental disorders and across generations. Comorbidity, discussed yesterday both at the wonderful panel discussion and in some of the symposia, comorbidity amongst the most prevalent developmental neurocognitive disorders, reading problems, language learning problems, ADHD, comorbidity is so common. Dyslexia and reading disability are frequently comorbid in the same individual in up to half of the cases. And the same is true if you're studying ADHD or you're studying math disabilities. We've known for a very long time that reading disability and reading ability are both familial and heritable. And so family history is one of the very most important risk factors for whether a child will have issues learning to read. And there's a great deal of lovely ongoing research now following children who come from families with a history of developmental dyslexia. Geneticists have studied and have some candidate genes associated with developmental dyslexia and reading disability, and with language impairment and with speech sound disorder. And you will notice in this Venn diagram, I can't use my laser pointer today, that right in the middle at the intersection, many of these risk genes are common to dyslexia and language impairment and speech sound disorder. We've known for some 15 years about the 3 areas of the left hemisphere that become increasingly specialized for reading development as reading skill is acquired. And we thank Ken Pugh for all of his amazing work in this area. But today, towards the end of 2017, we understand that it's not just these 3 areas in isolation, it's the degree of integration of reading and language at the neurobiological level that's the true signature of reading development and becoming a skilled reader. So, why do so many children and youth struggle with learning to read? Can they all be at genetic or neurobiological risk? Well, we know that many children come to school today with brains and environments and developmental histories that predispose them to reading acquisition disorders. We've known for a long time that environment and developmental history is very, very important to language development. We also know, and I particularly IDA appreciates, that language competence is a foundation for so much of later school achievement. We know from some old studies that still hold up today and have been replicated that vocabulary use at 3 years of age predicts language skills and reading comprehension at 10 years of age. Also, within the last couple of years, we're starting to see the neurobiological signature of environmental risk factors. Some lovely work conducted by John Gabrielli and his colleagues and reported this year have studied children with reading disorders who come from higher and lower socioeconomic circumstances. Children with reading disabilities and lower SES have smaller vocabularies than children with reading disabilities from higher SES. These children have also been found to have reduced cortical thickness in multiple neocortical areas associated with language development and reading development. We also know, and there was mention of this by Robin Morris in our symposium on reading intervention yesterday, that connectivity within the reading brain occurs through white matter tracts. In studies of underlying white matter tracts and measures of white matter integrity provide a window on how different cortical reading areas communicate with each other. We know, and we'll hear in the keynote tomorrow, how learning to read spurs reorganization as the brain scaffolds reading onto regions that were specialized for speech and language development and for vision. We know from new work that was done in Houston and reported this year that there are differences in measures of white matter integrity between typical and poor readers that are suggestive that maybe our struggling readers are relying more on individual tracks than on a more efficient use of a coordinated reading network in the brain. So we see, and we've been aware for a long time, that the story is incredibly complicated. There are multiple levels of connectivity and reciprocity that exist across brain, behavior, genetics, and the experiences of the children we see. But do any of these neurobiological and etiological insights inform us at all when it comes to helping a child who needs help learning to read? Does it inform instruction or intervention in any way? Well, I believe that there are themes that are important to us in intervention. One is that we know from the work on brain that reading acquisition follows a prescribed developmental sequence. And our instruction and our intervention should be structured to facilitate a systematic acquisition of a system of reading skills. Reading is scaffolded upon speech and language competence, and we aim for that in visual and in oral language. We know also that reading development begins with phonological awareness, proceeds to acquiring the alphabetic code, and later development of automatized, speeded word identification and word reading. And we know that skilled reading can only happen, it will only develop with a very high degree of integration across component skills in the system, in linguistic, representations, and in neurobiological circuitry within the brain. Integration depends on rapid access to different components in the reading system, and speed is essential to integration. Speed and fluency and automaticity, what Marianne Wolf has told us for decades in her work on naming speed and fluency. So all of these findings are instructive in terms of pointing us in the right direction on how you construct a reading brain. Now, in the second part of this presentation, I would like to ask your patience while I share some of our journey in terms of doing intervention research on reading disabilities. I'm going to share some of the lessons learned from our early intervention research. Then I'll talk very briefly about some of the elements of effective intervention that we have seen in working with older struggling readers and teens. And finally, ask the question of, do we know what leads to better outcomes for children, teens, and adults who struggle with reading? Now, more than 35 years ago, I was a newly hatched green researcher starting in this medical school and research institute in Toronto. And I was hired by these two eminent neurologists and posed some really gut-wrenching kinds of questions. Dr. John Stobo Pritchard, who had been head of child neurology and known internationally for a long time, was incredulous and asked me, why was there no scientific literature on effective treatment for children with learning problems? He was succeeded in our division of child neurology by Dr. Bill Logan, who became a very close friend, and he always questioned, is it even possible to conduct rigorous research on the treatment of learning disabilities? Remember, this is the early 80s, and it was before the time that NICHD funded some of the amazing reading intervention work that happened. So being young, green, and very conscientious, I set about trying to figure out, well, how could we build and evaluate reading interventions to answer questions in a scientifically rigorous way about what works? So we developed, say, reading treatment A, and we compared it with reading treatment B that had a slightly different emphasis or approach, and we compared that with control treatment C that worked on other learning problems that the children had in terms of study skills and math. And instructional pairs were randomly assigned to one of three conditions there. Well, from that very first early experience, we had both a range of huge remedial successes and glaring remedial failures. I found that we could double a disabled reader's estimated reading vocabulary on measures, improve spelling, get reading speed going with intensive intervention, but if we taught them to read fine and shark, they failed to recognize pine and dark. How could that be? We taught them fine and shark, and they practiced in the example of fine on mine, wine, line, and nine, but we held out one of those orthographic relatives to be used just as a test word. And my gosh, the kids had learned fine and shark and the rhymes we taught, but at post-test, they were no better than kids in the control condition in accurately being able to decode pine and dark. It was mind-boggling. But really, it was the most instructive development because it really got me thinking about this as a transfer of learning problem. And transfer of learning problems really provided for us as a little group at that point a window on some of the core dyslexic learning disabilities that were making reading development so difficult. So I thought a lot about some of the mechanisms by which generalization occurs in word recognition learning. And for any researchers out there, there's an omission. More recently recognized statistical learning isn't identified as a mechanism, but it's hard to illustrate. And we developed targeted interventions that worked on phonological and subsyllabic segmentation problems that explicitly taught for transfer by teaching decoding strategies and metacognitive monitoring skills. So we built a set of interventions for severe reading disabilities that develop skills and knowledge in one of three major domains. All of our interventions have a skill-building component. We address the phonological deficit, we work on transfer of learning, and our skills instruction is very carefully scaffolded. Also, through all of our programs, we have a heavy metacognitive focus, and we teach reading strategies that work. So we emphasize a paradigm of cognitive strategy use. And last but not least, so many of our kids have misguided attributions and very limited motivation for learning to read. And so we built in some motivation building aspects to it. In our interventions, we use an apprenticeship model of learning where students are apprentices to an expert reader, initially the teacher, but then over time, as the kids acquire skills, they take turns being the expert. We have a system of scaffolded instruction where we teach a framework of integrated foundational skills and then scaffold specific strategy acquisition on top of it. But it's fine to teach strategies, but there's no point in doing it if you don't teach all of the prerequisite skills the kids are going to need to use those strategies effectively. We had a dialogue structure of learning that embeds implicit attributional retraining, and we explicitly teach the kids how to self-monitor and evaluate whether their strategies are working. And so we tried this out, and my gosh, we got another big surprise. And this just is an example of one very successful child in the program, a 10-year-old girl with reading disabilities from early years, went through with these new approaches, and she had come to us making one-syllable word substitutions, wall for who, leave for left. But after intensive small group instruction, she was able to figure out accurately, not quickly, but accurately, unintelligible, disengaged, mistakenly, and our all-time whopper difficult word, uncomprehendingly. It might take 5 minutes per word, but the point is she had acquired the knowledge, the skills, and the confidence in herself to be able to attempt and use her skills to get that. So these insights really led to the further growth and development of our program at the Hospital for Sick Children. And so for 35 plus years, we've been working together, developing methods of remediating language learning problems in children, in teenagers, and most recently in struggling adult readers, and evaluating them in controlled research designs. Over the decades, we've seen more than 6,500 kids and teens in our laboratory classrooms, and we've reached in the last 10 years more than 31,000 struggling readers through our outreach programs. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about a study, and I talked about this actually in our symposium yesterday because it's a very important set of results for me. It's our early grades intervention research, and here you'll see our collaborators and co-PIs on this, Robin Morris in the first row and Marianne Wolf sitting right next to him. And we conducted over 10 years in total a set of intervention studies in multiple classrooms in multiple schools in Boston, Atlanta, and Toronto. And they were controlled intervention studies. The one I want to talk about today provided intense reading intervention to at-risk and identified children either in first grade, in second grade, or in third grade. And I'm going to go through this quickly, so I'm going to focus just on the two bolded questions. One, do we get different benefits by intervening at different grades, first, second, or third? And second, does graded intervention affect rates of normalization of reading skills for readers? Now, our research-based reading interventions, small group interventions delivered on a 1-to-4 ratio, an hour a day, a pull-out intervention given 125 hours over a whole school year. And the intervention we used was the multiple component intervention that we nicknamed our triple. And it combined the PHAST program with the RAVO program developed by Marianne Wolf. So we put together interventions that we had developed in our previous NIH-funded work and integrated it to see what would happen. Now, our PHAST program comes from Toronto. It's now known as Empower Reading, Decoding and Spelling, but our decoding lessons always have 4 parts. A skill-building part of acquiring prerequisite skills you'll need to execute a strategy. Training on 5 decoding strategies introduced gradually over time. Strategy practice on difficult, what the kids call college words, using this dialogue teaching model, and using your strategies while reading connected text for meaning. These are the word identification strategies we use, a left to right phonological sounding out strategy with very precise articulation and learning of sounds and alternate sounds, and very, very precise sound blending procedures. Rhyming, using onsets and rhymes within the syllable as a decoding strategy. Peeling off prefixes and suffixes in a multisyllabic word. My all-time favorite strategy, you're not supposed to have a favorite, but my favorite is vowel alert, where the kids learn alternate vowel pronunciations and use that to help them in decoding, and SPY, which was a little cleanup strategy we used to seek the part you know in a compound word. The kids learned prefixes and suffixes gradually over time and had a peeling off tree where the prefixes appeared in the green leaves of spring and the suffixes in the yellow leaves of fall. They learned in the skill building part to try 2 pronunciations for single vowels, and for vowel pairs, they learned the pronunciation of alternate sounds that vowel pair makes in decreasing order of the frequency with which they occur in the English language. So, for instance, if a child saw this difficult word in front of them, first they'd look to see, is there anything to peel off at the beginning or the end? I peel off I peel off E. Then they look for a vowel, and uh-oh, there's a double trouble twin there. Well, I know that it could say E is in bead, is in head, A is in great. They try the first one, leathery. I don't think I know a word, leathery. They try the second one, leathery, leatherly. I know about leather. I think that's the one, but let me try the third one just in case. Leathery. No, I think it's leatherly. I use peeling off and vowel alert, and I got that word. I was persistent and I stuck at it. So those are the kinds of strategies they learned in the triple program, in the FAST portion. Then they had wonderful exposure to parts of Marianne Wolf's RAVO program. Now, RAVO is the ultimate multiple component program designed to improve fluency and fluent comprehension of text with the implicit goal of automating word recognition and sublexical analysis. So there are wonderful vocabulary elaboration components to the program based on the knowledge that the better a word is known, the faster it's retrieved. So RAVO puts an emphasis on multiple meaning words, building flexibility in word use and word knowledge, aiming for semantic depth and semantic breadth in our mental lexicons, and also works with orthography and morphological endings in words. It also has a very important motivation building component because it aims to get the children extremely engaged with and interested in their own language. There are many fun activities to practice skills and strategies. There's a personal exploration of language and words and multiple meanings, and children take ownership and develop interest in that. So this doesn't do justice to our triple, but to give you a quick idea of some of what we found, one thing we looked at is after a year of intervention, so children received the program in first grade, or in second grade, or in third grade, what proportion of them were hitting the appropriate for age, the normal level of reading scores on the Woodcock reading test? Here, if you look in the first column under word attack, the pattern jumps out at you. If a child received intervention in first grade, almost 78% of them were functioning within age-appropriate levels on the norms at the end of grade 1. In grade 2, only 50%. With intervention in grade 3, 38%. And you can see the pattern goes down. So, children were either participated in the intervention group or they were in a control group that waited for access to the intervention. So we had triple children who got the program and control children who didn't at each grade. On the green line here, you see how the grade 1 control children did waiting. They're learning. They're still moving forward, and this is on passage comprehension on the Woodcock. But this is how children who got the triple did. They're equally at risk and impaired in terms of their reading acquisition skills. Look at how sharply they grew. And you'll notice the control children contribute data up to post-test at 125 hours. But children who had the triple intervention, we followed till the end of grade 4. Once a year, we would see how they would do. The grade 2 control children and the grade 2 intervention children. So you see, there's a little bit of a difference. Grade 2 control children are learning a little less without intervention, and the grade 2 intervention children aren't quite as steep in their learning trajectory. This is what the follow-up data look like for the intervention children till the end of grade 4. These are the first graders in the triple, the second graders, and the third graders. You see the same thing on word attack, that was word identification, first graders, second graders, and third graders. So what have we learned from this fairly complicated study? One thing just jumps out at us, that earlier is definitely better. Early intervention results in far greater normalization of reading scores, and early intervention benefits were seen particularly on foundational reading skills. Kids who got the triple program in first or second grade made gains relative to the weighting controls that were almost twice as big as those between the triple children in third grade and their controls. Also, if you looked at the trajectories over the follow-up years, the first graders in intervention continued to grow at faster rates over the follow-up years, faster than the kids who got the intervention in second grade on 6 out of the 8 outcomes. So this was really dramatic. These data were just published last week in the Journal of Educational Psychology. We did find on some more advanced metalinguistic measures a greater benefit for second and third graders who got the triple program on just on a few of the more advanced things. So we see there is abundant controlled evidence of the efficacy of early intervention for reading problems in dyslexia. But what about all those older struggling readers we see? And there are lots of them. Can meaningful gains still be demonstrated within a school year? Can we make a difference across the board in terms of different reading skills? Do different profiles predict response to different approaches? Now, I know many of you have worked with older struggling readers, and you know that there are special considerations to working with middle and high school students. We need to form small groups of students at similar levels of reading skill, and the influence of learning and working on intervention with one's peers is enormous. We know that in high school, reading remediation needs to earn academic credits, and we know that the kids are very savvy. They have to buy into the process, and they have to see that they're acquiring skills that are necessary and will help them in all their subjects. So we actually did a middle school intervention study with our pals in Atlanta, Robin Morris and Rose Sevchek, and with a researcher from our team, Young Freighters. And we randomly assigned kids in small instructional groups to one of 3 conditions. We assigned them to one of 2 versions of our Toronto research programs, a FAST comprehension or a FAST fluency program, or to a special education control group. And in the special education control group, teachers used the best they had for remediating reading disabilities with kids at this stage. All of our kids met criteria for reading disability. They received 100 to 125 hours of this small group remediation in multiple sites in Toronto and Atlanta. And this study was funded by IES, the Institute of Education Sciences. These older kids learned the very same word identification strategies. They learn prefixes and suffixes using age-appropriate materials. I've taken this from the younger kids one. They learned about variable vowel pronunciations, and they received instruction in decoding and word identification. They received instruction in a daily basis and vocabulary. And then they received one of two different versions of comprehension and text reading. And I'm not really going to go into them because they produced exactly the same effect overall, as you'll see. Comprehension strategies, we have the acronym PACES, but these are comprehension strategies you'll all recognize. The Fluency-Focus program followed Marianne Wolf's and Tammy Katzier's model, multiple component model of reading fluency that was published in 2001. And so use fluency activities at the sound, affix, word, phrase, sentence level, worked at all levels of the system to improve speed. Now, what we saw is just summarized here across those famous Woodcock-Johnson reading subtests. In the yellow, you will see the average growth of kids who participated in the special ed control group. In the purple, you'll see growth in word attack, and in the red, you will see growth in passage comprehension. In green, growth in reading fluency, and in blue, growth in word identification. And again, you'll see that the control kids participate in the testing to post-test, and then they're offered the option of participating after. But our kids who participated in the research-based interventions were followed up a year later to see if they maintained their gains. And you see that in all but the word attack case, they did. But notice, they do not show over follow-up the very steep trajectory of growth we saw for first graders who got intervention. This is just looking at one measure. Passage comprehension, you see the special ed kids did well, the special ed teachers did well, and kids made gains. But kids in the research-based intervention made steeper gains and maintained them. This is the same pattern of results for word identification. But there's something else I mentioned when I talked about our intervention, and that is the whole social, emotional, and motivational piece. Do these program benefits extend beyond reading growth to affect the motivational profiles of our struggling readers? Now, our colleague Young Freiters, who's a researcher with our group and a professor at Brock University in Canada, has studied the motivational profile of adolescents who struggle with reading and those who don't. And he's found, in terms of intrinsic motivation for reading, just what you would expect. The RD youth are much less interested in reading, and they see themselves as far less competent readers. He also adapted something called the Sydney Attributional Scale and made it particular to reading and learning about literacy. And he found, and I think this is critical, that youth with reading disabilities and dyslexia were far more likely to attribute failure to their own abilities and success to things beyond their control. So they took ownership of everything that didn't work, but if they were successful on a learning task, it was due to the teacher being in a good mood or other things beyond their control. Now, you'll notice that in our instructional dialogues that the kids acquired and used when implementing the strategies, there was in every example of dialogue a motivation booster. So always at the end, here a child has worked through the word unplowed, and says, now I put the word together. Unplowed, that doesn't make a real word, but I don't give up. Now I'll try ows and cow. Plow. Now I'll put the word together again. Unplowed. Yes, that's a real word. I used peeling off and vowel alert, and it worked. I was flexible, I stuck at it, and I got that word. We have other motivation building activities once the class is moving along and acquiring many strategies. One of our classes, this is a picture sent by a teacher in rural Ontario, one of our classes was so enthused about difficult words that they'd go home and take words from their older brothers and sisters' textbooks or look at the dictionary and try and find the hardest word that English had to offer. And then they would see, could they figure it out with the strategies they'd learned in class? And here's one example of a sweet little girl in grade 5, and the teacher had to take a picture of this. She found the word magnetohydrodynamics, and she was able to figure it out with rhyming and vowel alert and peeling off. It was, you can imagine how encouraging that is and how much more self-efficacy these kids feel. So what about quantitative measure? Did these children make motivational gains? And here you see the kids that got the research-based intervention in the red made significant gains in terms of their motivation for reading relative to the kids in the control. They also maintained these gains over a year follow-up. So what have we learned from all that data? Well, we've learned that intervention in middle school, and we have other data from high school, can yield robust treatment effects. Improvement is seen on all dimensions of reading skill, word reading, fluency, reading comprehension, but relatively few are normalized with 1 year of intervention. We've seen that motivational and attributional factors need to be woven into our instructional and intervention dialogue on a daily basis. And I didn't show it here now, but we've established that the benefits of these approaches exist for children and youth who vary in socioeconomic status, in IQ, and in first language status at entry. I'm going to very quickly show you just a few slides. We've developed and adapted some of these techniques in working in developing a reading comprehension for adult literacy learners as part of the Center for the Study of Adult Literacy, based here in Atlanta at Georgia State University and led by Daphne Greenberg, funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. Now, these are not adult dyslexics per se, but rather adult literacy learners who want to improve their literacy skills, usually to find a job. We built a hybrid program that has teacher-led instruction that we call Adult Fast Paces, and an amazing computer program, an intelligent tutoring system developed for adult literacy learners by one of the other PIs, Dr. Art Gracer at the University of Memphis. Classes are 2 to 3 hours in length twice a week, and the adults get 100 instructional hours. And the data are being processed and analyzed now, but this shows you the proportion of adults in the intervention classes who made statistically reliable pre-post gains by measures. So you see the first two measures test instructional material, and as you go further out, you go to more distal measures and achievement measures. So good proportions between a third to two-thirds are making gains depending on measure and showing they are able to grow. It suggests that the intervention exerted its greatest impact on the adult's decoding skills, and it points to the importance of always including decoding and word identification instruction in adult literacy programs. Our learners in these classes expressed incredible desire for more training in decoding and spelling, and the final results are not in. Now, last but certainly not least, I want to talk a little bit about reaching out and how we can share what we have all learned to date through dissemination of research findings, through translation of effective practices from laboratory to community classrooms, and through partnerships with vulnerable communities. Now, in the case of our program at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, we started by developing methods and evaluating them in our laboratory classrooms. The programs were taught according to a rigorous research design by our research teachers. Then when programs developed to a point in which we had some good, rigorous data of efficacy, we translated into community translation research, where we mentored teachers in the community to teach these programs that had worked in our laboratory classroom on one condition, and that was that the school accepted that there would be random assignment and control groups, etc. Then when things became even further refined and crystallized, our institution, under pressure from some of the school systems to get access to these methods, our institution published and trademarked our programs under the title Empower Reading. And so for the past 10.5 years, we have been implementing this program. Empower implementation has happened in elementary, middle, and high schools across Canada, and I'll just give you a quick peek. These are some of our partnerships with participating school boards. Since the first semester of 2006, the fall semester, we've trained more than 2,200 teachers and seen more than 31,000 children and teens who have received instruction in Empower Reading. Now, and I can't stress this too much, the very best designed, best thought out, evidence-based models of intervention will not produce results without an infrastructure to support and sustain quality implementation. This is what Louise... This is what Louisa Moats has been teaching us for decades, and what IDA understands so well. Teachers want the professional development training, but they want training that will meet their students' needs and lead to better outcomes. But we all know that there are factors of school culture that will be incredibly important. The administrator's buy-in and enthusiasm, a teacher's openness to change, and organizational support for quality implementation. Now, in our case, we've developed a set of 4 programs. A 5th one is about to come out. And the programs are made available to participating school boards through, they purchase them from the Hospital for Sick Children. But we would never allow any materials out without them also buying into the services that accompany the materials. And the professional training is extensive and proceeds over a 2-year period. Every new Empower teacher has to attend training workshops, typically 4 days spread through the year. They have on-site visits from their mentor who comes to the class they're teaching, supports them, helps them, email and phone communication with the mentor, internal web-based chat rooms in some boards, and we used web-based technology and video conferencing for remote sites. Now, once the programs are in the outreach form, in knowledge translation as Empower Reading, we don't do more research or collect more data with them, but we really encourage the school boards to collect data and outcomes and make sure they're getting good results. So this is a very recent example shared with me from one school board. And it shows the Hamilton Wentworth Board had DRA, Developmental Reading Assessment scores on kids for 2 years before and 2 years after their Empower implementation. So you see in the first, I missed my pointer, you see the before Empower, then you see during the year they received Empower and following Empower, and you see there's a real change in trajectory. Some of the school boards have reported distributions of DRA results working with grade 2 children. Other boards have used running records. A lot of these measures more familiar to many of you than to me. And another board, Avon Maitland, has recently followed kids through a follow-up year to see if they maintained and still grew in their gains. So that gives you a flavor of our outreach, but one thing we've been involved in heavily in the last 1 to 2 years is seeing whether or not we can make partnerships in vulnerable communities and underserviced remote communities. And one is that we have developed a partnership with the Cree School Board. Many of you may be aware that there is a literacy and educational gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians, with almost 2/3 of our Aboriginal population in Canada scoring far too low on literacy measures to be able to use the information around them to build a better life for themselves and their families. So we were approached by the Cree School Board, a wonderful group of people in remote communities who were very interested in improving the learning outcomes of their students while also holding dear the Cree identity in their partnerships. We work at this point with 8 remote communities around James Bay, and we've worked hard to respect and include aspects of the Cree language, for instance. Some of our posters for teachers are in English and in Cree. We've had very, very good experiences, and they too have collected some data looking at the response of their children on instructed and uninstructed material, testing them at pre-test, mid-program, and post-test, and on their own response to intervention measures. In this case, I think they're using benchmarks. We also have an outreach program with one of IDA's global partners, the Dr. Anjali Morris Education and Health Foundation in Pune, India. And this has been led by Maria De Palma, who's here with us this morning and who will be presenting with our IDA Global Partner at 3:15 this afternoon about this work. And Maria's in the lovely orange sari in the middle. I'm going to skip through this because my prompter is showing me I'm getting short of time. This only began in June 2016, but within a year, Maria had expanded within AMF and out to a few Pune schools and trained an additional 21 teachers there. And in March, we hosted 3 of the teachers from AMF to come to Toronto and to begin their training to be local trainers and mentors in Pune. Again, we've encouraged the site to collect data to see if kids are learning. These are the first 40 kids through the program. This is their response on Woodcock-Johnson, raw scores and standard scores. And I just want to say in ending that part that we know that there are huge challenges. We're realistic about the challenges involved in global implementation. There's low English language proficiency of the children receiving the programs, limited English language skills of some of the teachers there. And importantly, this has been very much a one-woman operation by Maria, who has done all of the teacher training and mentoring, traveling to India a few times a year, and mentoring classes through Skype and video conferencing in the middle of the night because of the 10.5-hour time difference. This is passion and commitment. So we're currently involved in attempting to train trainers there and in ongoing dialogue with our partners, focusing on how to reduce barriers, facilitate in-depth teacher training and mentoring, and ensure quality implementation. Now, I am closing, and I want to, my husband's looking relieved, and I want to acknowledge the concept of Ubuntu from South Africa. I am because we are, and I wouldn't be here this morning were it not for the wonderful family with whom I work in Toronto, the Learning Disabilities Research Program, starting from the left, Karen Steinbach and Maria De Palma, who's here, who run All Things Empower, All Things Outreach, who ran research at every different level and have worked with us for 22 to 26 years, respectively. Jen Gowdy, who runs our adult literacy programs, and Jan Freiters, who does the motivational and statistical work and is an important part of our program. Leah Lacerenza in the red, who is our chief curriculum writer and teacher trainer and has been with us for 30 years. Meredith Temple, who's been with us. I also wouldn't be here without the inspiration and fun that I've had with my closest colleagues and friends of the last 30 years doing this work. Robin Morris and Marianne Wolfe, my good friend Ken Pugh, Mark Seidenberg, Yun, who pops up everywhere, and of course, our very own Don Compton. I also want to acknowledge everything I'm learning from my newer colleagues and friends in the Center for Adult Literacy, our leader, Daphne Greenberg, in the middle, Art Gracer to her right, Jan Freiters also there, and Lee Branham Martin. I need to acknowledge the funding agencies who have funded our work for all these decades, most notably NICHD and the Institute of Education Sciences, and some important school board partnerships that have facilitated this. I acknowledge my home institution, the Research Institute there, and the belief and commitment that research helps kids all over the place. And last, but certainly not least, I have to acknowledge an incredible home team. My husband of 35 years, Rod Barron, who tells me I'm over time again, I've talked too much, and my very beloved Lovett Barron boys and girls, who are always an inspiration and source of incredible joy in my life. I want to end with this quote from someone you know well, Marianne Wolfe, and this is in a book that she published last year, Tales of Literacy for the 21st Century. And this is a quote: if you ever feel tired, discouraged, and feel that maybe this is just too hard, this quote will underline for you the incredible importance of what we're all doing together. Marianne says, literacy alters the brain in profoundly transformative ways, which alters the person, which alters the species, which alters humanity itself. There is little more important for the future of our species' intellectual development. And with that, I thank Marianne for her words, and I thank all of you for your patience.